This story is titled, Grandpa and Grandma Left My Child at the Hospital, saying special people will take care of him. We can't miss your Golden Brothers celebration. Years later, when they were rushed to emergency, they begged my son to look after them. Soup Reddit, my name is Marcus, and I'm 35 years old. I own a chain of casual dining restaurants that I've been building for the past 12 years. Getting to where I am today wasn't an easy road by any means. Looking back, my childhood was basically a masterclass in how to raise one kid while clearly favoring another, and I was definitely not the favored one. I was always the responsible child in our family. Throughout school, I maintained straight A's, played varsity football, and worked part-time jobs from the time I turned 16. Meanwhile, my younger brother Danny, who's now 29, seemed to get praised for managing to put his own shoes on correctly. I'm honestly not exaggerating much when I say that. The bar was set incredibly low for him while mine was always sky high. My father worked as a mechanical engineer and made decent money. But he was the kind of man who believed that showing any emotion meant you weren't a real man. My mother taught high school history and somehow had endless patience for Danny's constant screw-ups, but none whatsoever for mine. I'll never forget bringing home a report card with all A's and 1 B+, only to have my mother immediately ask what happened with that B+. Danny, on the other hand, would bring home C's and D's, and they'd actually take him out for pizza as a reward for trying his best. I moved out when I was 19, determined to make something of myself without their help. I put myself through community college while working in restaurant kitchens during the day. The work was hard and the hours were long, but I was learning the business from the ground up. After 2 years, I transferred to the University of Central Florida to finish my business degree. Those were some of the most challenging years of my life. I was working 70-hour weeks, splitting my time between restaurant shifts during the day and classes at night. I never once asked my parents for a dime, and I was proud of that independence. By the time I turned 28, I had saved enough money to start my own restaurant business. It began as a small operation, just a single location serving burgers and wings, but I was determined to build something lasting. I gradually developed a reputation for quality food and excellent service, which started attracting the attention of potential investors. Within a few years, I was able to open a second location, then a third. It was at my second restaurant that I met Jessica when I hired her as a manager. She was incredibly smart, had a no-nonsense approach to business, and possessed this infectious laugh that could literally light up any room she entered. We connected immediately, both personally and professionally. I married her when I was 31, and we welcomed our son Tyler just a year later. For a while, life felt absolutely perfect. My business was growing steadily. We had bought a house in a decent neighborhood with excellent schools, and I was managing to make it home for dinner most nights despite my demanding schedule. I had everything I had ever wanted, a loving wife, a beautiful son, and a successful business that I had built from nothing. Then, when I was 33 years old, everything in my perfect life shattered completely. Jessica was driving home from work on what seemed like an ordinary evening when some complete idiot ran a red light at 65 miles per hour in a 40 miles per hour zone. She died on impact. The police later told me that she probably never even knew what hit her. 1 second she was there, and the next she was gone forever. In the span of a single moment, I went from being a happily married father and successful business owner to planning a funeral and trying to explain to a confused 4-year-old why mommy wasn't coming home anymore. The transition from having everything to losing the most important person in my world happened so fast that my mind couldn't even process it properly. The first few weeks after Jessica's death were nothing but a blur of grief and responsibility. I remember sitting on Tyler's bed night after night as he cried himself to sleep, asking over and over when mommy was coming back. I had to hold myself together during those moments, being strong for him and trying to provide some sense of comfort and stability. But once he finally dozed off, I would go downstairs and completely fall apart, sobbing until I had no tears left. My parents showed up for the funeral, of course. My father stood there awkwardly in his best suit, patting my shoulder exactly once and mumbling that Jessica had been a good woman. My mother hugged me with the same stiffness I remembered from childhood and spent most of the funeral service fussing over Danny, who was apparently so devastated by his sister-in-law's death that he needed constant attention and comfort. After the service, they stayed for the reception at our house, but they didn't linger long. Before the evening was over, they announced that they had to get back home because Danny needed help moving into his new apartment. The same apartment that my father had co-signed for because Danny's credit was completely shot from maxing out multiple credit cards on various failed business ventures. They didn't even leave us a casserole or any food for the difficult days ahead. More importantly, in the weeks that followed Jessica's death, I didn't receive a single phone call from them to check on Tyler or me. There were no offers to watch Tyler so I could catch up on work or even just have an hour to grieve my wife in peace. Jessica's mother, Linda, however, was a completely different story. She flew in from Miami the day after the accident and stayed with us for 4 entire months. At 68 years old, Linda suffered from arthritis that made every movement painful for her, but she never once complained. Every single morning, she would get up with Tyler, make his breakfast, and take him to preschool. Then she would come home and tackle whatever needed to be done: laundry, cleaning, or preparing meals that could be frozen for later when she wasn't there to help. During those long, dark nights when the silence in the house became too overwhelming to bear, Linda would sit with me without saying much, just being present when I needed someone most. When she finally had to return to Miami, because she was the primary caretaker for her brother who had Parkinson's disease, she cried harder than I had seen since the day of Jessica's funeral. She made me promise to call her every single day, and she kept that promise by coming back every few months to spend quality time with Tyler. After losing Jessica, I had to rebuild our entire life piece by piece. I hired a part-time nanny who would pick Tyler up from preschool and stay with him until I could get home from work. I completely rearranged my work schedule so that I could be home by 6:30 p.m. most days, and I taught myself to cook more than just the basic grilled cheese sandwiches and spaghetti that had been the extent of my culinary skills. Slowly but surely, Tyler and I established new routines and found our new normal. I would occasionally reach out to my parents, mostly because I felt Tyler should have some connection with his grandparents, despite everything. They would agree to see him maybe once every few months, but always on their schedule and their terms. These visits usually consisted of an hour or two at some restaurant where they would spend most of the time on their phones or talking about Danny's latest brilliant business idea that just needed a little startup money to get off the ground. So yes, my parents had always been self-centered narcissists who prioritized Danny over everything else in their lives. But what happened 6 years ago was the final straw that made me cut them off completely and permanently. It was a morning in March that I'll never forget, partly because I had a huge investor meeting scheduled for that afternoon. I was mentally running through my presentation while making Tyler breakfast, trying to balance being a present father with the demands of running a growing business. Tyler was 7 years old then, in 2nd grade, and completely obsessed with dinosaurs and outer space. He had this incredible ability to absorb facts and share them with the enthusiasm that only a 7-year-old could muster. That morning, he was sitting at the kitchen counter eating his cereal and excitedly telling me about how a T-Rex couldn't actually run very fast because of its massive body weight. This was something he had learned from a documentary we had watched together the night before, and he was explaining it to me with the same seriousness that a professor might use in a lecture hall. I was listening while sipping my coffee and reviewing my notes for the meeting. Then, suddenly, and without any warning, Tyler stopped mid-sentence. His spoon dropped from his hand and clattered loudly against his cereal bowl. When I looked up from my coffee, I saw his eyes rolling back into his head in a way that immediately filled me with terror. Before I could even reach him, he slid off the kitchen stool and collapsed onto the floor. His entire body went rigid, and then he started convulsing violently. Blood began pouring from his nose, and I realized with horror that he had bitten completely through his tongue. The sight of my little boy seizing on the kitchen floor while blood pooled around his mouth is something that will haunt me for the rest of my life. Fortunately, after Jessica's death, I had taken a comprehensive first aid course. It was one of those things I did to try to feel less helpless in a world that had already proven just how little control I actually had over the things that mattered most. I immediately turned Tyler onto his side to make sure he wasn't choking on his own blood, and I started timing the seizure on my watch. When the seizure passed the 3-minute mark with absolutely no sign of stopping, I knew this was something far more serious than I could handle at home. I scooped Tyler up in my arms, grabbed my car keys, and ran to the garage. I laid him across the back seat where he was still seizing uncontrollably, and I drove to the hospital like I was in some kind of high-speed chase. The drive to the hospital normally takes about 18 minutes, but I made it in under 8 minutes that morning. I was blowing through red lights and stop signs, honking my horn and flashing my headlights at anyone who might slow me down. When I reached the emergency entrance, I didn't even bother looking for a parking space. I pulled right up to the doors, left my car running, and carried Tyler inside while shouting for help. A team of nurses and a doctor immediately rushed over with a gurney. As they laid Tyler down, his small body was still jerking uncontrollably, and there was blood and foam around his mouth that made him look like he was dying right in front of me. The doctor quickly asked me, "How long has he been seizing?" I checked my watch and told him, "About 11 minutes now." Without wasting another second, they rushed him back into the treatment area, shouting medical terms that I didn't understand, but that sounded urgent and terrifying. A nurse directed me to the registration desk while they took Tyler away to try to save his life. I stood there with Tyler's blood still on my shirt, mechanically answering questions and filling out forms with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. The paperwork seemed endless and pointless when all I wanted was to be with my son, but I knew I had to complete it before they would give me any information about his condition. 5 agonizing hours passed before Dr. Rivera finally came out to speak with me. She was a woman in her mid-40s with tired eyes and a direct, no-nonsense manner that I actually appreciated in that moment. She sat down next to me and delivered news that made my blood run cold. "Mr. Wilson, your son has bacterial meningitis," she said, looking directly into my eyes. "It's extremely serious. The bacteria have caused severe inflammation in the membranes around his brain and spinal cord, and the seizure was a direct result of this inflammation. We've started him on the most powerful antibiotics we have available, but I need you to understand that the next 48 hours are absolutely critical for his survival." Dr. Rivera went on to explain that they were admitting Tyler to the intensive care unit immediately. The meningitis had progressed with frightening speed, and they were deeply concerned about increased intracranial pressure, essentially, dangerous swelling in his brain. If the antibiotics didn't work quickly enough to reduce this swelling, they might need to perform an emergency surgical procedure to relieve the pressure and prevent permanent brain damage or death. I followed behind as they wheeled Tyler up to the ICU, watching my little boy lying unconscious and connected to more machines than I could count. A ventilator was breathing for him because his body was too weak to do it on its own. IVs ran into both of his small arms, delivering the life-saving medications directly into his bloodstream. Monitors surrounded his bed, beeping steadily as they measured every vital function and tracked whether he was getting better or worse. I sat down in the chair beside his bed and took his limp hand in mine, trying to process how we had gone from him excitedly explaining dinosaur facts at breakfast to this absolute nightmare in just a few hours. The contrast was so surreal that part of me kept expecting to wake up from what had to be the worst dream of my life. Between the constant stream of doctors and nurses checking on Tyler, I spent the day making phone calls to reschedule everything on my calendar. My general manager immediately stepped up to handle all the day-to-day restaurant operations without me having to ask. My clients were completely understanding once I explained the emergency situation with Tyler. Most of the meetings and appointments could be rescheduled without any major problems. However, there was one absolutely critical meeting that I couldn't reschedule, no matter how much I wanted to be nowhere else but by Tyler's side. After 11 long years of building my company from a single restaurant into a successful chain, we were finally about to land the most important contract in our history. We were expanding into 3 new cities with a major Hong Kong investment group, and this deal would change everything for our business. The investors had flown in from Hong Kong specifically for this one evening to sign the paperwork and finalize all the details. The entire deal hinged on me being present from 7 p.m. to 11 p.m. to answer questions, review the final terms, and sign the contracts. My business partner Robert was in London that week meeting with suppliers, which meant I was the only person who could sign off on the final terms and make this deal happen. If I missed this meeting, there was a very real chance that the investors would walk away completely. They had other restaurant chains lined up and ready to work with them, and they had made it clear that they needed to see our complete commitment to this partnership. This contract would allow me to hire more qualified staff, take on much bigger projects, and most importantly, create the kind of financial security for Tyler that would ensure he never had to worry about money the way I had growing up. After losing Jessica, making sure that Tyler was provided for financially had become my singular focus and driving motivation. I needed this deal to go through, not for my ego or even for the business itself, but for Tyler's future security. I called the head nurse to get an update on Tyler's condition. "He's stable for now," she told me, which was both reassuring and terrifying at the same time. The antibiotics are being administered according to schedule, and we're monitoring his intracranial pressure very closely. The neurologist will be doing regular checks throughout the evening to make sure there are no changes in his condition. That's when I made the decision to call my parents. They lived only 20 minutes away from the hospital in the same house where I had grown up, and despite our complicated relationship over the years, they were Tyler's grandparents. Surely, in a true medical emergency like this, they would step up and do the right thing. Mom, it's Marcus, I said when she answered the phone on the second ring. Tyler is in the ICU with bacterial meningitis, I continued, my voice probably betraying more desperation than I intended. It's really, really serious. I need you and Dad to come sit with him for just 5 hours tonight while I close this business deal. It's absolutely critical for Tyler's future. Of course, Marcus, she said without any hesitation whatsoever. We'll be there right away. Don't worry about Tyler for even a second. Just focus on your meeting and getting this deal done. Hearing her agree so readily and enthusiastically sent a massive wave of relief through my entire body. Despite all of our complicated history and the favoritism they had always shown Danny, they were still Tyler's grandparents. In a real emergency involving their grandson's life, I believed they would absolutely step up and do what needed to be done. By 6 p.m., my parents had arrived at the hospital. My father nodded at me with his typical stoic greeting, the same emotionally distant acknowledgement I had received from him my entire life. My mother gently patted Tyler's hand and smoothed his hair back from his forehead with what seemed like genuine concern and affection. "We've got this covered, Marcus," she said with confidence. "Go handle your business meeting. This is important for your future and Tyler's future." I spent time walking them through absolutely everything they needed to know. I explained which doctors were attending to Tyler, what the nurses had told me about watching for any signs of increased pressure in his brain, when his next medications were due, and what all the different machines and monitors were measuring. I wrote down the address where my client meeting would be held and told them exactly when I expected to be back at the hospital. "Call me immediately if anything changes," I emphasized, looking both of them directly in the eyes. "I mean anything at all, no matter how small it seems. If a doctor wants to talk to someone, if a nurse has questions, if Tyler's condition changes in any way, you call me right away." "Go, Marcus," my mother said as she settled into the chair beside Tyler's bed. "This business deal is important for your future and Tyler's security. We completely understand how critical this is. We'll call you if anything changes, but try to focus on getting this contract signed." I leaned down and kissed Tyler's forehead, whispered that Daddy would be back soon, and thanked my parents again for stepping up when I really needed them. Then I left for the meeting, feeling guilty about leaving Tyler, but trusting that my parents would stay with him and keep him safe. Despite all of our history and complicated relationship, I believed that they would do the right thing in a true emergency involving their grandson's life. The meeting with the Hong Kong investors was being held at an upscale hotel in downtown Orlando. Mr. Chen and his entire team were waiting in the hotel's conference room when I arrived, all of them dressed in impeccable business suits while I was still wearing the same clothes from that morning, minus the bloody shirt I had changed out of at the hospital. "Mr. Wilson," Mr. Chen greeted me with a firm handshake and direct eye contact. "We're very eager to finalize our partnership with your company tonight." I apologized for my appearance and explained briefly that there had been a serious family emergency earlier in the day, but that I was fully committed to our meeting and completely focused on moving forward with our business relationship. Mr. Chen nodded respectfully and said he completely understood, and we immediately got down to business. The negotiations went surprisingly smoothly, much better than I had expected given the emotional stress I was under. We thoroughly reviewed the expansion plans for all 3 new cities, discussed realistic timelines for opening each location, and hammered out the final cost details and profit-sharing arrangements. By 9:30 p.m., Mr. Chen and his team were satisfied with everything we had discussed and were ready to sign all the contracts. I instinctively checked my phone and realized that I had put it on silent mode for the meeting and had forgotten to check it during our negotiations. I was relieved to see that there were no missed calls or text messages, which I took as a good sign that Tyler must be stable and doing well. Mr. Chen noticed my glance at my phone and the concerned expression that must have crossed my face. "You look worried, Mr. Wilson. Is everything all right with your family situation?" I hesitated for a moment, not wanting to derail the meeting when we were so incredibly close to finishing everything and getting the contract signed. "My 7-year-old son is in the ICU with bacterial meningitis," I admitted. "My parents are with him at the hospital, but I can't help worrying." Mr. Chen immediately raised his hand to stop me from saying anything else. "Say no more, Mr. Wilson. Family always comes first, especially when a child is involved. We can finish this tomorrow if you need to get back to the hospital." I was completely taken aback by his understanding and flexibility, especially given that his team had flown halfway around the world specifically for this meeting. Thank you so much for understanding, but I think we're almost finished here, I replied. Let's get all the paperwork signed and completed, and then I can get back to Tyler. We signed all the contracts within the next 45 minutes, finalizing every detail of our partnership. As we shook hands to conclude the deal, Mr. Chen held onto my hand for a moment longer than was typical for a business handshake. Mr. Wilson, my eldest grandson became very seriously ill when he was about your son's age, he said, looking directly into my eyes. I missed what was supposed to be an important business meeting to stay by his side in the hospital. That company ended up going with another partner, but my grandson recovered completely. I have never regretted my choice for even a single moment. His words hit me harder than I expected, and I thanked him sincerely for sharing that story with me. I grabbed my briefcase and drove back to the hospital as quickly as I could, arriving at 10:20 p.m. When I stepped off the elevator at the ICU, I immediately sensed that something was very wrong. There was an unusual flurry of activity around Tyler's room, with medical staff moving quickly and purposefully in a way that made my stomach drop. When I walked into his room, I saw his bed surrounded by a team of nurses and Dr. Rivera. They were frantically adjusting equipment, checking monitors, and attaching new IV bags to his small body. What I didn't see was any sign of my parents anywhere in the room or the surrounding area. Dr. Rivera looked up when she noticed me enter, and her face immediately shifted from professional medical concern to barely contained anger. The expression on her face told me that something terrible had happened while I was gone. Mr. Wilson, where have you been? She asked sharply. We've been trying to reach someone for the past 4 hours. Your son's intracranial pressure spiked dangerously about 3 hours ago, and we had to perform an emergency ventriculostomy to relieve the pressure on his brain. A ventri what? I asked, my mind racing to catch up with what she was telling me. We had to drill a small hole in his skull to insert a drain and reduce the pressure, Dr. Rivera explained, seeing the confusion and horror on my face. No one was here to give consent for the procedure. We had to do it under emergency protocol because if we had waited any longer, he could have suffered permanent brain damage or died. I stood there completely frozen, trying to process what she was saying. My parents were supposed to be here with Tyler. I had left them here at 6:30 p.m. with explicit instructions to call me if anything changed, and now it was after 10 p.m. and they were nowhere to be found. Nick, the charge nurse, stepped forward with an expression that mixed sympathy with visible frustration. Sir, no one has been here with your son since approximately 7:20 p.m., he said. We called all the numbers in his medical file repeatedly throughout the evening. When we couldn't reach anyone and your son's condition deteriorated rapidly, we had to implement emergency protocols to proceed with the life-saving treatment he needed. I immediately checked my phone and felt my heart sink. There were 19 missed calls from the hospital, all of them during the time when I had silenced my phone for the business meeting. In my rush to make the meeting on time and my focus on getting the contract signed, I had completely forgotten to check my phone during the negotiations. I called my mother's cell phone immediately. No answer. I tried my father's phone with the same result. I called over and over again, leaving increasingly desperate and angry voicemails demanding to know where they were and why they had abandoned Tyler when he needed them most. Where are you? Why did you leave Tyler? Call me back right now! I shouted into their voicemail boxes, my voice cracking with a combination of fear, rage, and desperation. I sat down beside Tyler's bed, watching the ventilator push air into his tiny body and staring at the fresh bandage covering the spot where they had drilled into his skull to save his life. Dr. Rivera assured me that they had caught the pressure spike just in time, but barely. Without the emergency ventriculostomy procedure, Tyler could have died or suffered permanent, irreversible brain damage while I was signing business contracts across town. Around 1 a.m., I still hadn't heard a single word from my parents. I decided to open Facebook to post an update for friends and family members who might want to know about Tyler's condition and send prayers or positive thoughts our way. The very first post in my newsfeed stopped me cold and made my blood run ice cold with rage. It was a photo of my brother Danny surrounded by friends at Ruth's Chris Steakhouse downtown. There was a large 29 inches balloon floating behind him in the background. The caption read, "Best birthday dinner ever. Thanks Mom and Dad for the surprise party." The photo had been posted at 8:45 p.m., right in the middle of the time when Tyler was fighting for his life, and the hospital was desperately trying to reach someone who cared about him. Tagged in the photo were both of my parents, smiling broadly and raising glasses in a celebratory toast while their grandson was having a hole drilled in his skull to prevent his brain from swelling to the point of death. They had left my critically ill son alone in the ICU to throw a surprise birthday dinner for Danny at an expensive steakhouse. They hadn't even bothered to call the hospital to check on Tyler's condition before they left, during the dinner, or at any point during the evening. For all they knew, Tyler could have died while they were ordering appetizers and singing happy birthday to their favorite child. I stared at that photo for what felt like an eternity, watching my parents' happy, carefree faces as the pieces of their betrayal fell into place. The anger that rose up inside me was unlike anything I had ever experienced before. It was cold, clarifying, and permanent. I took multiple screenshots of the Facebook post, carefully noting the timestamps that proved exactly when they had posted it and when they had been celebrating. Then I closed the app and focused entirely on my son, who was lying in a hospital bed with a drain coming out of his skull because the people who were supposed to protect him had abandoned him for a birthday party. Tyler remained unconscious throughout the entire night, and I never left his side. The nurses came in every hour on the hour to check his vital signs and monitor the drainage from the ventriculostomy procedure. Each time they entered the room, they assured me that Tyler was stable, that his intracranial pressure was steadily decreasing, and that the powerful antibiotics were finally beginning to work against the bacterial infection. I didn't sleep for even a minute. I sat in that uncomfortable hospital chair beside his bed, holding his small hand in mine and watching every breath that the ventilator pushed into his body. The sound of all the machines keeping him alive became a constant background soundtrack that I knew I would never be able to forget. At exactly 7 a.m., my parents finally walked into the ICU like absolutely nothing had happened. I was still sitting in the exact same position where they had left me the night before, except now, Tyler had a thick bandage wrapped around his head and a medical drain protruding from his skull, where surgeons had been forced to operate to save his life. My father spoke first, using the same casual tone he might use to ask about the weather. "How's he doing?" he asked, as if he had just stepped out for a few minutes. "We just went to get some breakfast." The laugh that came out of me was so cold and bitter that it surprised even me. "Breakfast?" I said, staring at them both. "For 14 straight hours?" My mother's face immediately tightened into the defensive expression I remembered from childhood whenever she was caught in a lie or confronted about her behavior. "What's that supposed to mean?" she snapped. I turned my phone screen toward them, displaying Danny's Facebook post that was still open on my browser. The timestamp, the location, their smiling faces raising toasts while Tyler fought for his life, all of it was right there in undeniable digital evidence. They both froze when they saw the photo, realizing that their lie had been completely exposed. My father recovered first, his face settling into the same dismissive expression I had seen countless times throughout my childhood, whenever he was confronted with something he didn't want to deal with. "It was just for an hour or two," he said defensively. "Danny had been planning this celebration for months, and we couldn't just cancel on him. They drilled a hole in my son's skull last night," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, but filled with more rage than I had ever felt in my entire life. "He could have died. I wasn't here to give consent because I trusted you to stay with him and call me if anything happened." My mother straightened up with the same self-righteous indignation she had always displayed when challenged. "You're completely overreacting, Marcus. This is a hospital. Tyler was fine because there were doctors and nurses everywhere. But Danny's 29th birthday only happens once in his entire life, and we couldn't miss that." Those words hit me like a physical blow. In that single moment, I saw with perfect, crystal-clear clarity exactly where Tyler and I stood in their priorities. Danny's birthday dinner at an expensive restaurant would always be infinitely more important to them than my son's life hanging in the balance. "Get out," I said firmly. "Right now." "You're just being overly dramatic as usual," my mother snapped back. "We helped you out when you needed us, and this is how you show your appreciation? You've always been completely ungrateful for everything we do for you." "At least Danny appreciates what we do for him," she added with the same venom I remembered from countless childhood arguments. "I said get out," I repeated, this time loud enough that my voice carried into the hallway. "Get out of this room right now." A security guard appeared in the doorway, obviously alerted by our raised voices and the tension in the room. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, looking between all of us. My father put his hand on my mother's shoulder, finally recognizing that the situation was escalating beyond their control. "Let's go," he said quietly. He's always been like this, making mountains out of molehills and blowing everything out of proportion. As they walked toward the door, my mother turned back one final time with a look of pure spite on her face. "Don't call us for help again, ever," she said coldly. I met her gaze without flinching. "Don't worry," I replied. "I won't make that mistake again." After they left the room, I sat back down beside Tyler's bed, and a strange sense of calmness settled over my entire body. Something fundamental had shifted permanently inside me. The last remaining thread connecting me to my parents had finally snapped completely. And surprisingly, instead of feeling loss or regret, it felt like freedom. Dr. Rivera came in later that morning to check on Tyler's progress. She carefully examined the ventriculostomy site, reviewed his latest laboratory results, and made adjustments to his antibiotic dosages based on how his body was responding to the treatment. "He's stabilizing nicely," she told me with the first genuinely positive tone I had heard from her since this nightmare began. "The emergency procedure went very well, and the latest bacterial cultures show that the antibiotics are definitely working against the infection. But we're not completely out of the woods yet. We need to monitor him very closely for at least another 48 hours to make sure there are no complications." I nodded, feeling too emotionally and physically exhausted to speak. She sat down in the chair next to mine, setting her clipboard on her lap and looking at me with an expression that was both professional and deeply concerned. "Mr. Wilson, as Tyler's attending physician, I need to tell you something important," she said, her voice low but absolutely firm. I looked up at her, bracing myself for more bad news about Tyler's condition or his long-term prognosis. "What happened last night was a serious case of medical neglect," she continued, meeting my eyes directly. "Your parents abandoned a critically ill child in the ICU without notifying the medical staff or ensuring that someone responsible was available to make necessary medical decisions. If we hadn't caught the pressure increase when we did..." She let the sentence hang unfinished, but the implication was clear. She paused for a moment, then continued. "I've documented everything thoroughly in Tyler's medical chart. The exact time your parents left the hospital, our repeated attempts to contact both you and them throughout the evening, and the emergency protocol we had to implement to save your son's life. If you want to pursue this situation legally, you have very strong grounds to do so." I stared at her, genuinely surprised by her suggestion. "You think I should sue my own parents?" I asked. She met my gaze steadily and said, "I think what they did could very easily have cost your son his life. I've been practicing medicine for 22 years, and I've seen far too many children seriously harmed because the adults in their lives didn't take their responsibilities seriously enough. That's all I'm saying." After Dr. Rivera left the room, I called Jessica's mother, Linda, in Miami. She answered on the very first ring, as she always did whenever I called her about Tyler. "How's my boy doing?" she asked immediately, without even saying hello first. This was typical of Linda. Tyler's well-being was always her first and only concern whenever we spoke. She had been calling every single day since Tyler was hospitalized to check on his condition and see if there was anything she could do to help. I told her everything that had happened. The bacterial meningitis diagnosis, the emergency brain surgery that Tyler had needed, and most importantly, how my parents had abandoned him in the ICU to attend Danny's surprise birthday dinner at an expensive restaurant. "I'm getting on the next available flight," she said without any hesitation whatsoever. "Don't you dare move from Tyler's side until I get there. I'll be there as soon as humanly possible." My business partner, Robert, called next. I had sent him a brief text message about the medical emergency before my meeting with the Hong Kong investors, so he knew that something serious was happening with Tyler. "How did the meeting go?" I asked him first, because I knew the business had to keep running even during this crisis. "The deal is completely signed and finalized," he told me with obvious relief in his voice. "But Tyler's condition is much worse than we originally thought, isn't it?" "The Hong Kong investors were incredibly understanding about the whole situation," Robert continued. "Mr. Chen actually called me this morning to check on how things went. He speaks very highly of you and said you showed exceptional character in how you handled such a difficult situation. They're fully committed to working with our company long-term." He paused for a moment, then added, "Don't worry about anything related to the business right now. Focus completely on your son and his recovery. The restaurants can run perfectly fine without you for as long as necessary. We have really good people working for us, and everyone understands that family comes first." That afternoon, a nurse came into Tyler's room carrying some paperwork and a business card. "Are you Marcus Wilson?" she asked. When I nodded, she handed me the card and explained, "This is Jason Mercer. He's the hospital's legal counsel, and he'd like to speak with you when you have a moment to discuss what happened last night." Jason turned out to be a sharp-looking man in his 40s, with a very direct, no-nonsense manner that reminded me of Dr. Rivera. He explained that the hospital had a legal obligation to report cases of child endangerment to the appropriate authorities whenever they occurred on hospital property. "What happened with your son last night falls squarely into that category," he said matter-of-factly. The hospital will be making an official report to Child Protective Services, but you also have legal options available to you as Tyler's father. He spent the next hour outlining what a civil lawsuit against my parents might look like. He explained the legal grounds for charges of negligence, child endangerment, and emotional distress. He discussed the potential monetary damages I could seek to cover Tyler's medical bills, ongoing care, and the trauma that both Tyler and I had experienced. He also walked me through what the legal process and timeline would look like if I decided to move forward. You should definitely talk to your own attorney before making any final decisions, he advised as he prepared to leave. But I want to stress that you shouldn't wait too long to decide. There are statutes of limitations on these types of legal matters, and evidence can become harder to gather as time passes. By the time Linda arrived that evening, I had already made my decision. My parents had shown me exactly who they were and where Tyler and I ranked in their life priorities with crystal clarity. Now I was going to show them that there were real, serious consequences for making that choice. Tyler ended up spending 3 full weeks in the hospital. The bacterial meningitis had been caught just in time to prevent any permanent brain damage. But his recovery process was going to be long and difficult. He suffered from severe headaches, constant fatigue, and extreme sensitivity to both light and sound that made even normal daily activities challenging for him. Linda never left our side during those 3 weeks. Despite being 68 years old with arthritis that made every single movement painful for her, she never once complained about sleeping in the uncomfortable hospital chair next to Tyler's bed every night. She organized meal deliveries from friends and family members who wanted to help. She handled all the logistics that I was too emotionally and physically exhausted to manage myself. I worked out a practical system with my company during Tyler's hospitalization. I would go into the office for exactly 3 hours each morning, while Linda stayed with Tyler at the hospital. Then, I would return to the hospital for the rest of the day and stay through the night. My general manager stepped up in incredible ways, handling all the restaurant operations and client meetings that I couldn't attend. Remarkably, we didn't lose a single contract or client during this entire period. Mr. Chen, the Hong Kong investor, surprised me by showing up at the hospital one morning during Tyler's second week of recovery. He brought with him a beautiful hand-carved wooden spaceship that he had specially made for Tyler, and he insisted on rescheduling all of our upcoming planning meetings until after Tyler was completely discharged and recovered. "Business can always wait," he said simply when I tried to apologize for the delays. "I've been exactly where you are right now. 22 years ago, my own daughter had leukemia, and I almost lost a major business deal because I refused to leave her side during her treatment. You know what happened? That company eventually became my biggest and most important client because they respected how I handled that crisis." He handed me his business card with his personal phone number written on the back. "Call me when you're ready to move forward with our plans," he said. "The deal will still be there waiting for you, and we'll be even more committed to working with someone who has his priorities straight." When Tyler was finally discharged from the hospital, we established a completely new routine at home. Linda moved into my guest room, insisting it was just until Tyler is back on his feet completely. But I knew she was planning to stay as long as we needed her. Having her there was an incredible blessing. She understood what Tyler was going through and knew exactly how to help him during his recovery. 2 of my employees, Kevin and Marcus, started showing up at our house on weekends to help with yard work and various house repairs that I had been neglecting during Tyler's hospitalization. Kevin would sit with Tyler for hours, teaching him elaborate card tricks and telling him fascinating stories while I caught up on work that had piled up. Marcus regularly brought his own kids over to play with Tyler once he was feeling stronger, giving Tyler some much-needed normal kid time and social interaction that helped him feel less isolated during his recovery. 4 months after Tyler came home from the hospital, I scheduled a meeting with Anthony Reeves, a lawyer who specialized in personal injury cases and medical negligence lawsuits. I brought with me all the documentation I had carefully gathered: Tyler's complete medical records, the hospital incident reports detailing my parents' abandonment, screenshots of Danny's Facebook post with the timestamps proving exactly where they were during Tyler's emergency, and my phone records showing all the missed calls from the hospital that I hadn't been able to answer during the business meeting. Anthony reviewed everything meticulously, taking his time to understand every detail of what had happened that night. "This is definitely a strong case," he finally said after examining all the evidence. "But I want to be completely clear with you about something important. Suing family members is always messy, and it gets very personal very quickly. They stopped being my family the moment they walked out on my son when he needed them most. I replied without hesitation. Even so, you need to be prepared for what's coming, Anthony warned me. They'll likely claim that you're the one who actually abandoned your son by going to a business meeting instead of staying at the hospital. They'll try to minimize what happened and make it seem like no big deal. They'll definitely try to make this emotional and turn it into a character assassination against you. We filed the lawsuit the following week. The charges included negligence, child endangerment, and emotional distress. We sought monetary damages to cover Tyler's extensive medical bills, his ongoing care and therapy needs, and compensation for the trauma that both Tyler and I had experienced as a direct result of their actions. The first court filing hit my parents like an absolute bomb. My father called me that same evening, absolutely raging about family betrayal and screaming about how I had always been jealous of Danny and was now trying to destroy the family out of spite. Name one single thing you've done for me in the last decade, I said calmly. I'll wait while you think about it. The silence on the phone line was all the answer I needed to hear. My mother tried a completely different approach a few days later. She called me in tears, sobbing about how this lawsuit would destroy our family forever and break your father's heart after everything he's done for you. When that emotional manipulation didn't work on me, she quickly switched to threats, telling me that everyone will know what an ungrateful, vindictive son you really are, and that I would regret this for the rest of my life. I didn't bother pointing out that having everyone know the truth about our relationship was a price I was completely willing to pay. I simply said, "See you in court," and hung up the phone. The lawsuit dragged on for over a year, with depositions, evidence gathering, and legal maneuvering on both sides. My parents hired an expensive attorney who tried desperately to paint me as an irresponsible father who had abandoned his critically ill child for a business meeting. But the hospital medical records were absolutely damning evidence that couldn't be disputed or explained away. Dr. Rivera's detailed testimony about the emergency brain surgery and my parents' complete disappearance during Tyler's medical crisis was particularly devastating to their defense. We had multiple witnesses who could testify about what had happened. Nurses who had tried repeatedly to contact someone about Tyler's deteriorating condition. The ICU receptionist who had logged the exact time my parents left the hospital. And even the waitress from Ruth's Chris Steakhouse who remembered my parents arriving for Danny's surprise party and commenting on the sweet balloon arrangement they had brought for the celebration. The final nail in the coffin of their defense was Danny's Facebook post with the clear timestamp and photos showing exactly where they were during Tyler's emergency. During his deposition, Danny's own testimony sealed their fate when he admitted that he had known my parents had left Tyler alone in the hospital to attend his surprise birthday party. "Did you consider asking your parents to stay with your nephew instead of coming to your party?" Anthony asked Danny during his deposition. Danny just shrugged with complete indifference and said, "It was my birthday." I watched the judge's facial expression during that particular piece of testimony, and I could tell that everything I needed to know about how this case would end was written clearly on her face. Throughout the entire legal process, Tyler continued to make steady progress in his recovery. The debilitating headaches that had plagued him for months gradually subsided to manageable levels. His energy slowly returned, allowing him to participate in normal childhood activities again. He was able to go back to school without any academic difficulties, rejoined his soccer team where he had always excelled, and even started taking karate lessons, which gave him confidence and helped him feel strong again. But perhaps most tellingly, Tyler never once asked about my parents during this entire period. He never wondered why his grandparents weren't visiting or calling. It was as if he instinctively understood that they had failed him when he needed them most, and he had simply moved on without them in his life. We won the lawsuit decisively. The judge's ruling was absolutely clear and unequivocal in its condemnation of my parents' actions. The court finds that the defendant's actions showed a reckless disregard for the welfare of a minor child in critical medical condition, the judge stated during the final hearing. This is not merely a family disagreement or a difference of opinion about priorities. This is a serious case of neglect that could have resulted in permanent injury or death. The defendants abandoned their responsibilities as caregivers during a medical emergency, and their actions directly endangered the life of a 7-year-old child. The final judgment was $900,000, awarded to cover Tyler's medical bills, ongoing care requirements, and emotional damages for both Tyler and myself. The judge also ordered my parents to pay all court costs and legal fees associated with the case. My parents weren't wealthy people, but they did have significant equity built up in their house after decades of mortgage payments, and they had what should have been decent retirement accounts. The judgment would force them to sell their family home and liquidate most of their savings to pay what they owed. This wasn't about the money for me. I wanted accountability and consequences for their actions. As we left the courthouse after the final hearing, my father approached me with an ashen, defeated look on his face. "You've completely ruined us," he said flatly, his voice devoid of any emotion except bitterness. "I hope you're satisfied with what you've accomplished here." I looked at him and felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no sadness, no regret, just complete emptiness where any familial connection used to exist. "No, Dad," I replied calmly. "You ruined yourselves the moment you walked out on Tyler when he was fighting for his life. This judgment is just the bill for that choice. All the money from the lawsuit went directly into a carefully structured trust fund for Tyler's education and future needs. I also set aside a significant portion specifically for any ongoing medical treatment he might require as he got older, in case there were any long-term effects from the meningitis that we hadn't discovered yet. I didn't want or need their money for myself. What I had wanted was acknowledgement that their actions had consequences, and that abandoning a critically ill child was unacceptable under any circumstances. 5 years passed after the lawsuit was finalized. Tyler, now 12 years old, had recovered completely with no lasting effects from the bacterial meningitis. He was consistently earning straight A's in school, played competitive soccer at a high level, and had developed a genuine passion for computer programming that impressed his teachers. He was thriving in every possible way. Linda had made the decision to permanently move to Orlando, purchasing a small but comfortable house just 12 minutes away from ours. She came over for dinner 3 times a week and had truly become the grandmother that Tyler deserved to have in his life. Kevin and Marcus had remained close family friends over the years, with our families spending holidays together and creating new traditions. They had become Tyler's honorary uncles in every way that mattered, teaching him to fish, helping him build an elaborate treehouse in our backyard, and showing up faithfully for his soccer games and school performances. The business contract with the Hong Kong investors had expanded far beyond our original agreement into a $7 million annual business relationship. Mr. Chen and I had developed a genuine friendship over the years, and his company had opened doors and created opportunities that I never could have imagined when I first started my single restaurant. My business now employed 52 people across multiple locations and had successfully expanded into 4 different states. Through mutual acquaintances, I heard occasional updates about my parents' situation. They had been forced to sell their family home and move into a small, cramped apartment across town. Danny's various business ventures had all failed spectacularly, one after another, and he had eventually moved in with them, still living off what little money they had left from the court settlement. The financial judgment had hit them much harder than I had anticipated. They had appealed the court's decision, but lost decisively. After paying all the legal fees associated with their failed appeal, they were left with minimal savings for their retirement years. My father, now 72 years old, had been forced to go back to work as a consulting engineer. But at his age, the available opportunities were extremely limited and poorly paid. The comfortable retirement they had planned was completely gone, replaced by financial stress and uncertainty about their future. Then, one evening, my phone rang with a number that I didn't recognize. When I answered, a professional voice said, "Mr. Wilson, this is Orlando General Hospital. Your mother has been admitted with a severe cardiac event. She's stable for now, but she's been asking for you specifically." I sat there for a moment, letting those words sink in completely. "I understand," I finally said. "Thank you for letting me know." I didn't rush to the hospital in a panic the way I had when Tyler was sick. Instead, I calmly finished dinner with Tyler, helped him with his homework, and tucked him into bed with our usual bedtime routine. Only then did I drive slowly across town to the hospital, taking my time and parking in the same hospital garage where I had desperately rushed with Tyler years before during his medical emergency. When I walked into my mother's hospital room, she looked incredibly small and fragile lying in that bed. She was connected to an array of tubes and wires that monitored her vital signs and kept her stable. My father sat slumped in a chair beside her bed, looking every single one of his 72 years and then some. The stress and financial pressure of the past few years had clearly taken a heavy toll on both of them. My father's head snapped up the moment he saw me enter the room. "Marcus, thank God you came," he said with obvious desperation in his voice. "We really need your help with this situation." I didn't say anything in response. I just stood there looking at both of them, taking in the scene and waiting to hear what they had to say. "Your mother needs bypass surgery," my father continued, his his voice getting more urgent. Our insurance isn't going to cover all of the costs, and we've completely exhausted what little savings we had left after the lawsuit. Danny, he trailed off, unable to finish that sentence, but we all knew what he meant. Danny can't help us financially, he finally admitted with obvious shame. My mother reached out with a pale, trembling hand toward me. Marcus, I know we've had our differences over the years, but I'm still your mother, she said weakly. Please help us. We literally have nowhere else to turn. I looked down at her outstretched hand, and all I could think about was Tyler's small fingers, wrapped in hospital bandages while the ventilator breathed for him. I remembered the fresh surgical site where they had drilled into his skull to save his life, while my parents were across town eating birthday cake and singing to Danny. The surgery, my father pressed desperately. It's going to cost $150,000 that insurance won't cover. We can pay you back slowly once your mother recovers and gets back on her feet. Like you paid back the court judgment? I asked quietly. My father's face flushed red with embarrassment and anger. That was completely different, he snapped. That was you being vindictive and trying to punish us. Marcus, please, my mother whispered, her voice barely audible. I'm begging you. I stepped closer to her hospital bed and looked down at her with complete calmness. You know, when Tyler was lying in that ICU bed and the doctors had to drill a hole into his skull because his brain was swelling dangerously, there was no one there to hold his hand. No one who loved him was there to speak for him or comfort him during the most terrifying experience of his young life. And do you know why? I paused, letting the weight of my words sink in completely. Because you chose Danny's birthday party over your grandson's life. Tears filled her eyes as the full impact of her actions was thrown back at her. I'm so sorry, Marcus. I was wrong. We were both wrong about that night. Please don't punish me for one mistake. Please don't let me die because of one bad decision. I leaned in close to her so she could hear every word clearly. It wasn't one mistake, and it wasn't one bad decision. It was a lifetime of showing me exactly where I stood in your priorities. And now you know exactly where you stand in mine. I straightened up and prepared to leave the room. You'll be fine, I said, matter-of-factly. But you know what? Tyler's birthday only happens once a year, too. The shock and recognition on her face when she heard her own words thrown back at her was absolutely priceless. After all these years, she finally understood how those words had felt when she said them to me. My father jumped up from his chair, his face red with rage. You heartless bastard! After everything we did for you growing up! I turned to face him with complete calm. Name one thing, Dad. I'm still waiting for you to give me even a single example. All the fight went out of him, and he deflated back into his chair heavily, unable to come up with a single response. I walked toward the door, then paused one final time. I'll have my assistant drop off a check tomorrow for $12,000, I said, without turning around. That should be enough for a consultation with a cardiac specialist who can help you arrange a payment plan with the hospital for the surgery. That's it? My father asked incredulously. Your mother could die and that's all you're going to do? I looked back at them both one last time. This is a hospital, I said, echoing my mother's own words from years ago. She'll be fine because there are doctors and nurses everywhere. Then I added, consider the $12,000 a gift from Tyler. I asked him what I thought I should do in this situation, and he said, help Grandma a little bit, Dad. Not because she deserves it, but because we're not like them. The next day, I had my lawyer personally deliver the check to the hospital, along with official paperwork that legally released my parents from any future claims of financial support from me. At the bottom of the document, I had written in my own handwriting, this concludes our relationship. This closes our account permanently. That evening, I sat out on my deck with Linda, Kevin, and Marcus, watching Tyler play soccer in the backyard with Marcus's kids. The sound of their laughter and shouts filled the air as they ran around having the kind of carefree childhood fun that every kid deserves. Are you okay with how you handled everything today? Linda asked, squeezing my hand gently. I nodded, watching my son's face light up with pure joy as he scored a goal against the older kids. Yeah, I said with complete certainty. We're going to be just fine. For years, I had believed that family was fundamentally about blood ties and obligation. That being related to someone automatically created bonds and responsibilities that couldn't be broken. What I've learned through this entire experience is that real family is actually about who shows up for you, not just in the happy, celebratory moments when it's easy and convenient, but especially in the hardest, most difficult times when you really need them. Kevin, Marcus, Linda, and Mr. Chen. These people who had absolutely no biological obligation to Tyler and me stepped up and supported us when it mattered most. They didn't hesitate to sacrifice their own time, comfort, and resources to help us through our darkest period. That's what real family looks like, and it has nothing to do with sharing DNA. I think back to that terrible moment in the hospital sometimes, when Dr. Rivera told me that they had been forced to drill into my son's skull without parental consent because they had no other choice. How terrifyingly close I came to losing everything that truly mattered in my life. How my parents' selfish actions could have cost Tyler his life or his future, all because they couldn't miss a birthday dinner for their favorite child. My mother did survive her cardiac surgery, by the way. One of my former restaurant clients happened to be a highly skilled cardiologist who agreed to perform the procedure at a significantly reduced rate after I made the $12,000 contribution toward the costs. I only know this because he called me afterward to let me know that the surgery had gone well and that she was expected to make a full recovery. My parents never reached out to thank me for making the surgery possible, which told me everything I needed to know about their character. Danny tried calling me a few months later, asking for money to invest in what he described as a sure-thing business opportunity that couldn't possibly fail. I blocked his phone number immediately. He even showed up at my office once, somehow getting past the receptionist to pitch me on his latest guaranteed money-making scheme. I had security escort him out of the building before he could finish explaining his brilliant plan to me. Tyler asked me recently if he had other grandparents besides Linda. He was working on a family tree project for school and wanted to make sure he had included everyone who was important in our family. I told him the honest truth, that my parents were still alive somewhere, but they weren't part of our lives because they had made choices that showed they couldn't be trusted with his well-being or safety. Were they mean to you when you were little? He asked with genuine curiosity. Not exactly mean, I explained carefully. Just not there in the ways that really mattered when I needed them most. Tyler nodded with that surprising wisdom that kids sometimes display that completely floors you as a parent. Like how Kevin lost his own son in a car accident, but still has time to teach me magic tricks and help me with my science projects, he said thoughtfully. And like how Grandma Linda's knees hurt her every day, but she still comes to all my soccer games and cheers louder than anyone else. Exactly like that, I told him, feeling incredibly proud of his understanding. Last week, I received a letter in the mail from my father. The envelope was addressed in his distinctive handwriting, and for a moment I considered throwing it away without reading it. But curiosity got the better of me, so I opened it. The letter informed me that my mother had suffered another, more severe heart attack and hadn't survived this time. The funeral was being held at their old church, and he wrote that Tyler and I were welcome to attend if we wanted to pay our respects. I didn't go to the funeral. Instead, I sent a simple arrangement of flowers with a card that read, "I'm sorry for your loss." I wrote that because despite everything that had happened between us, there was a time many years ago when I called her mom and believed that she loved me. The thing is, I don't regret walking away from them. I don't regret filing the lawsuit that held them accountable for their actions. And I definitely don't regret choosing to build a family based on love, support, and genuine care rather than obligation and blood relation. Blood doesn't automatically make you family, actions do. How people treat you when you're vulnerable, how they respond when you need them most, how they prioritize your well-being against their own convenience. That's what determines who your real family is. I'm not saying that what I did was necessarily the right choice for everyone who finds themselves in a similar situation. Every family dynamic is different, and every person has to make their own decisions about what they can and cannot accept from the people in their lives. But it was absolutely the right choice for Tyler and me. Sometimes the most important family lesson you can learn is knowing when it's time to walk away from people who will never prioritize your well-being, and when it's time to start building something better with people who actually deserve to be in your life. We're living proof that you can create a loving, supportive family from the people who choose to show up for you, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is close the door on relationships that only bring pain and disappointment into your life.